Welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. And today we're focusing on one of the most important challenges every leader and learner faces, turning knowledge and great intentions into consistent, meaningful action. This episode is the second half of my conversation with two of the world's leading experts on the science of learning and memory. Dr. Henry Roediger is a preeminent cognitive psychologist and distinguished professor at Washington University in St. Louis. He's renowned globally for his research on human memory, retrieval practice, and effective learning. My other guest, Dr. Mark McDaniel, is internationally recognized for translating cognitive psychology into actionable strategies that help people master and retain complex material. He is also a professor at Washington University, and together they wrote the best-selling book, Make It Stick: The Science of Successful Learning. Now, you can listen to the first part of our conversation, which was the episode prior to this one, if you're looking for more foundational background on evidence-based learning. But today, we're going to dive deep into those practical strategies for transforming how teams and individuals actually remember, act, and perform, from conquering cramming and building actionable cues to using interleaving, elaboration, and reflection to make knowledge really stick. So whether you're leading others or learning for yourself, these science-backed practices will help take your performance to the next level. So let's get started. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Through candid conversations and expert perspectives, we dive into the challenges, breakthroughs, and practical lessons that shape exceptional leadership. Well, what advice do you have for leaders, for individuals, if they use retrieval practice, how often should they really truly revisit it over time? How far should the spacing out effect be?
Nobody knows the answer to that. It probably depends on the person, the type of material. Are you remembering history facts? Or are you remembering how to solve physics problems? And so, I tell people more retrieval practice is good. Spacing it out is good.
But you asked the question everybody asks, Charles. We get emails from students all the time that say, I read Make It Stick. I know spacing is going to be important, spaced retrieval practice, and I'm taking this huge civil service exam. How often should I space? And I mean, our answer is an elaboration on Roddy's, which is for each individual, try to space at a time period where you've forgotten some information, but not all of it. If you've forgotten all the information, that's probably too long an interval. If you remember it all, that's too short an interval. So adjust for yourself, reflect and adjust for yourself. If I'm forgetting 30 to 40%, I'm remembering 60%, good. That's a good spacing interval. And then I can work on that 30 to 40%. And then maybe you can space a little longer after that, but maybe not. So a rough heuristic is space at a time period where you've forgotten some, but not all. That would be a rough heuristic we might recommend.
You got to test yourself to find out where you are.
We do, you do. So, but then let me pull back to the very general question. One of the things that you were hoping to get to, which was that what would we hope that research would do in the next 10 years in the science of learning? And that's one thing that I would hope, is that we could get more information about that and come to a better understanding of exactly what the space interval should be. And as Roddy said, I think it's going to depend on the material, quite a bit on the material. It's going to depend on the amount of understanding you're achieving and so on. So there'll be some variables that go into that answer. But in addition, I'd like to see the science of learning do things like on mixing up practice across different sub-problems or topics to understand exactly what are good ways to mix. Do you mix after you've learned a certain amount? Do you mix right off the bat? What's the gauge or the level of mixing? Do you mix within problems of the same type, or do you mix within the content of an entire course? So these are really critical questions, and maybe this is a little bit in front of where we should be in terms of the program, but I think the science of learning really in the next 10 years would love to see progress on that. And then in 10 years, we can come on your show and we can have some really good answers for this.
Great. I love that guideline that you give to say, you don't want to have it to where it's too easy to recall, but not to where you've forgotten everything. And In so many cases, students in school, cramming worked because in the short term, cramming is an ineffective strategy. But when you get out into the work world, you don't want to just know it briefly for the short term. And that's where that mass practice, that cramming is really ineffective because you're going to forget a lot of it over time. And that effortful, desirable difficulty is making it more active and more effortful in your learning instead of a passive strategy. Those are the two, I feel, underlying principles that really need to adjust and direct you into what learning strategy is effective versus some that are not that effective at all. Mark, I'd like to move into kind of perspective memory. What is that, and what's one tactic a leader could use to help them based on your research in perspective memory?
Well, prospective memory is memory for to perform intentions that you've created at some appropriate moment in the future. And we've got prospective memory tasks every day, all of us, many of them. So you've got to remember to take the lunch into work that you packed. Last week, my wife packed a great lunch, left it in the refrigerator, got to work, and said, shoot, I forgot my lunch. That kind of thing. Remembering you're running by the library. You remember to put the library books you have to take back in your car. Remembering at work to give a colleague a message. It could be a kind of a personal message. It could be an important professional message. Remembering to make that odd meeting. So we generally remember to make meetings that are part of our typical schedule. But what about that odd meeting that's come up and it's scheduled maybe pretty hurriedly and you're not thinking much about it? Remembering to make that meeting. You can think of on and on and on, many prospective memory tasks. Remembering to take medication, remembering to turn off the stove after you finish cooking, which is something in independent living with older adults that's kind of a challenge. So those are our prospective memory tasks. And in the workplace, you can probably think of many more. So what can the business managers do to help people and remember prospective memory tasks? Well, people can remember the task, but the point is, do they remember to execute at the appropriate time? And so the key depends on understanding that unlike retrospective memory, which is what we've been talking about through all the podcast here, where you have to retrieve information upon demand. Teacher gives you a test. They've told you, remember that information. Tell me what you remember about it. In prospective memory, there's no external agent prompting you to remember. It all has to be initiated by you. And that is, it has to be pulled out of long-term memory without somebody asking you to remember. So a key for effective prospective memory is to have external cues that prompt that or cue that. And managers can be very effective if they engineer external cues that they know their employees are going to intersect with or interact with. And we find that once those cues are in the environment, prospective memory can be very good. So let me give you an example. It's a story I don't like to tell because it shows one of my own failings and as a parent, which is that my boys were on the tennis team in high school. They got a ride home with one of their friends every night. Except one morning they said to me, Dad, we don't have the ride. You need to pick us up at tennis at 5:30 today. And I said, no problem for me. That's what I study, prospective memory. So I So I wrote myself I had a sticky note. I wrote down, pick up boys from tennis at 5:30. I put that sticky note in my briefcase. I went to work and the sticky note stayed firmly packed in my briefcase the whole day. I got a call at 5:45. And my boy said, Dad, we're at tennis. Everyone's left. Can you come and pick us up? So the problem was that yes, I made myself a cue, but I didn't put it in a location where I could interact with it, where it would intersect with my attention. What I should have done was take that note out of my briefcase, put it on my computer screen, put it in front of me on the desk, put it on my calendar somewhere where I was going to see it throughout the day. And then I would have remembered that. And it's the same thing for every employee. If managers can set up these cues and make sure they're presented either digitally or paper and pencil or verbally in ways where the employee has to pay attention to it or intersect with it, then prospective memory is going to be quite good.
When you speak really to the environment playing an active role in it, when I talk with and interviewed Dr. BJ Fogg out of Stanford, there's also things you can do individually, implementation intentions, habit stacking, things that would help you remember it and cue it in your mind more frequently. But those retrieval cues, like what we said at the beginning, they're not talked about enough because you have the information in memory. In the most likely case of you not remembering something, it's because you can't retrieve it, not because it's not there. You just haven't provided a a vivid retrieval cue that comes to mind in the appropriate time in the appropriate context.
It's always there. It just isn't brought up at the right time. That's exactly right. And it's true, you can use internal cues like implementation intentions would be to set a specific time and an action. So my wife maybe should have said to her, this would be an implementation intention. When I open the door to the garage, I will remember my lunch. That would be an implementation intention. She could even imagine opening the door and grabbing the lunch, or better yet, she could imagine a big sandwich blocking her way into the garage. That would be a useful technique as well. The issue with that is you have to depend on the user, the remember, to actually go through those mental processes. And as a business manager, you might not be able to depend on that. The external cues are going to be more effective, but you're quite right, Charles. Any of those internal cues are good ways to help remember prospective memory tasks. Absolutely.
Let's move into another effective learning strategy that you mentioned, Mark, earlier, and that's interleaving, where you have two or more subjects that you're practicing during a practice session, because it provides a form of spacing as well. But it helps you really to helps your ability to discriminate between different types of problems more effectively, and hopefully retrieve them more easily.
Absolutely correct. Charles, you've got it. You've got it down.
Give us an example of how that would be used. I know that it's the common example is math, right? Because you can have different types of math problems and not doing 20 problems of the same type, but maybe doing 5 or 6, and once you got that structure down, then changing it up 5 or 6 on another type of structure, and then mixing them up. Because on the test, you're not gonna see them all together anyway. They're gonna be interleaved or mixed up on the test, so you have to be able to discriminate which processes to use based on the problem type.
You're absolutely right. And so when instructors in math, this is seems to be endemic, is that they give the student a kind of a problem. It might be doing a fraction, and then they have lots of practice on exactly that kind of problem. Of course, they change the numbers. And what they've done is they completely eliminated the opportunity for the student to understand these discriminative differences among problems. And once you eliminate that opportunity, how do you expect the learner to be able to do that later on when the problems come in a mixed format? And I want to point out, Charles, it's not just the exam. Maybe more critical is it's in your work world. So in the work world, does anybody ever tell you, Charles, well, this is this type of problem you studied in this math class, and so go ahead and solve it. Does anybody tell you that? No, they don't tell you. No, they don't tell you that. They say, Charles, here's the problem. Now you've had the training, go and solve it. You're faced with exactly the situation that the training didn't allow you to complete. So that, I mean, be, basically, this is a point that Roddy has studied extensively and is well known for, is the idea of you want to learn in a way that promotes transfer appropriate processing. So if you're learning in a mass, if you're solving all the same problems, right, that doesn't transfer. It's not appropriate for the situation where you're going to have to be solving different problems that aren't pre-identified for you. So you want to learn in the same way. You want to be given a lot of different problems and have to learn to make those discriminations so that it's appropriate for the kind of test that you're going to be faced with, a test or the business challenge or so on. Now, you're right, it's common in math, but what some people don't recognize is that in sports it could be very effective too. So we talk about and I don't know if the Bjorks talked about this, a study that was done with a baseball team. Did they talk about this where the batters either get trained on hitting a fastball after fastball after fastball, and then they go to curveball, curveball, then they go to changeup. And so one group of batters did this, another group got the pitches randomly intermixed. And the group that got the pitches randomly intermixed, so they get a fastball, maybe two curveballs, a changeup, they didn't know what was coming. Later on, 8 weeks into the season, now these are all good batters, but 8 weeks into the season, the ones who got the intermixed supplemental training, they were batting much better. It's the same thing. You don't know, the pitcher doesn't tell you what they're going to throw you. So you got to be able to pick up very quickly the features of that ball and its spin and so on that tell you what kind of pitch it is so you can adjust. And when you get the intermixed practice, that's exactly what you're able to learn. And I think that sports trainers don't understand this well because, I mean, you go to the golf course and they want you to hit 9 iron after 9 iron after 9 iron. Then they want you to 5 iron. When you're on the golf course, is that the kind of transfer task you have? Absolutely not. Well, unless you're like me. I can't hit any kind of shot. So yeah, I'm hitting my 9 iron over and over. But most golfers, they're going to hit the 5 iron and then the 8, and then maybe the. So it's the same thing in sports. And I talked to there was a professional hockey coach, I'm not going to name the team, who was he was from St. Louis and he was there for the summer, and he asked the dean, who was his friend, hockey player, what can I do? I need to learn some sports psychology because my management says if we get 3% better and maybe applying sports psychology, we'll win the Stanley Cup. And the dean said, we don't have that at WashU, but talk to Mark McDaniel about some training stuff. So I told him about intermix, and I said, do you intermix your practice? Well, no, not really. And I said, well, so they practice defensive clearouts, they practice going through the transition zone, they practice their attacks, and they do it for big blocks of time. I said, do you think your players could intermix? Do you think they could do 10 minutes one, 10 minutes the other? Oh, yeah, they're pros. They know exactly what we're talking about. So I said, that the science suggests intermix that up so that because players aren't playing 9 minutes in the defensive zone and then 9 minutes. No, it's 30 seconds in the defensive zone. Then they transition, then 30 seconds in the attack zone. So they're going to be able to really quickly recruit those different kinds of skills. So he said, okay, I'll try that. That team won the Stanley Cup that year. Now, I don't know. Now, Charles, I emailed him often. I said, were you doing this in practice? He was either too busy or he didn't want to share the secret. I don't know, but I didn't hear back. Or he thought I wanted money. I didn't. I was just said, this coach went to another team the next year, and that team won the Stanley Cup the next year. So I can't say that he was using those techniques, but I really do believe that any kind of movement toward that kind of practice technique in athletic skill building could be very, very important. So it's more than just math, for sure. And Ronnie's daughter, who's an MD now, very, very successful MD, she knows about the techniques and she uses them. And she said, in medical school, you have these large intestine cells and these small intestine cells, and they're pretty similar, but we have to learn about each of them. We have to learn, to identify characteristics on exam. And she said, it's all masked. We go over cell after cell on the small intestine, cell after cell, large intestine. She said, that's not what I'm doing. I'm mixing them up at a study. And she was, as you might imagine, just one of the top students in the class. So it's biology too, biology, math. Anytime you have things that are kind of similar, you have to discriminate. Pretty long-winded, Charles, but I'm pretty passionate about that.
And I love what you say too, because even if you know these strategies, you may not be knowing how to apply them in different contexts, which is so critical. Sports, entertainment, work. It's not just school. So once you know them, that's just the first step. And you really speak to this idea of transfer, which is huge in learning. You want the learning from the training to transfer. You want the learning from schools to transfer. And that's really difficult to do. And it speaks to how deeply you're processing things. So if you're going to process it in a deeper way versus a more superficial way, and you use the example for this concept of rule versus example learners. If you know the underlying rule, like with what interleaving helps you with, you can identify these problems in different contexts and know what problem set or what principles to employ to solve that problem. Whereas example learners are more superficial learning. They have to see it as similar to another example they've encountered in the past in order to be able to solve that. So speak to me more about that, the depth of processing to get to that rural learner stage and how that impacts transfer.
The key is I want to talk in the problems we use in the lab, people are learning a rule, but more generally, we're talking about abstractions. So, for example, when Roddy teaches intro psych, and he taught that a lot, I taught it a little bit, you teach classical conditioning. And Pavlov, the dog, is a good example of that, where they salivate up hearing a bell that was paired with food. And you can talk about the different components of classical conditioning, the conditioned stimulus, unconditional stimulus, condition, and so on. What you want is you want the students to pick up the abstraction about what a conditioned stimulus is, what an unconditioned stimulus is. But the example learners tie that in with the concrete situation of a dog hearing a tone. And as a consequence, if they don't have the abstraction, then they can't transfer when the situation changes. So the key is to get an understanding of the underlying principles. And the same thing happens in our chemistry courses at WashU. They complain to me because I'm a psychologist and they think I can help. I don't do that stuff. I do learning and memory. I can't help you with your stress of the, but in the chemistry class, there are principles, and then on the test, the principles are tested with a different kind of cover story. And the students say, this wasn't a fair test. This is not what we learned. It's not a fair test. And the instructor's saying, it's absolutely fair. It's the same abstraction. So you're getting at exactly that difference, Charles, between the students who are learning the example and they can't undress it and get to the abstraction, and the students who learn the abstraction, and they're the ones who say, well, this is a great test, it tested exactly what it should have tested. And so it's this idea about transfer, and transfer being supported by abstractions, but transfer is not supported when you're just memorizing the examples that are used in class.
What I found some effective strategies for me is you really have to have the knowledge level, right? I mean, you can't skip over that because people say, I just want to learn the deep process. I just want to learn the critical thinking pieces. And really, it's so unique to each area of expertise that you have to have a foundation of knowledge and understanding, and then see a myriad of examples, diverse examples, to where you can eventually collate that information to say, okay, now I know the principles at play. I'm sure both of you are familiar with this, but there was a famous experiment with physics students, those that had PhDs and those that were just coming into the field. And they asked them to categorize the physics problems that they encountered. Now, the new ones coming in categorized them by the superficial parts of the problem, right? These are all inclined problems. These are all the PhD says, no, this is Newton's second law by the underlying principles of physics. That's how they categorize the problem. So it's a whole nother level of understanding based on their in-depth background knowledge, but also about all the time that was spent with different types of problems to learn the underlying structure and have a deeper level of understanding of those concepts.
Well, you raise a really good point. In instructional situations, there's not much time to go over each topic. There's so many topics. So generally, students receive a prototypical example. And then when things deviate a little from that prototype, they have a hard time because they've just learned the prototype and not the underlying critical ingredients. And I agree with you. If there were time to give lots of variety of examples, then students might be able to understand what the common critical ingredients are. But this is a problem in our current instructional system, is that we have very little time to do that. And we depend on the students to extract that abstraction. And that's kind of a mismatch too, because as you say, you generally need a lot of examples in order to figure out what the critical aspects are. And that's a real challenge, I think, for instruction is how can we best in this short amount of time we have present instruction so students can grasp that underlying abstraction and principle. That's a really tough one. That's a really tough one.
And the other thing I see a problem with, and I'm sure Roddy and Mark, you've seen it as well, is that when experts, which they come to teach our courses as well, there's that curse of knowledge. That just because you're an expert at something doesn't mean you can teach it well. And a lot of times you're leaving out a lot of steps. Someone once told me that the expert's language is abstraction, but the novice's language is really around concrete examples. And they don't know how to explain it. They skip steps. So and you see this in sports all the time, right? The best sports stars are never usually the best coaches because even though you can do it very well, you aren't very good at explaining it. So unpack that a little more, that curse of knowledge, and really what instructors can do to overcome that, to speak more at a level that will connect with their audience, who's beginners.
Well, I can take that one. I think the curse of knowledge, often students complain not just about chemistry, but say calculus, that the professors had known calculus, since they were probably before undergraduates, and then they come into a class of people who are taking calculus because it's required for graduation, and some of them may have had it in high school and some didn't, and it's just this mismatch where the instructors are often talking at this very abstract level and thinking, boy, why am I going over this stuff? Everybody knows this. And the students are thinking, what is this guy talking about? I don't have a clue. And so you can see that in any area. When I taught introductory psychology, I tried almost as much as I could to never use a word they were already familiar with. Now, you've got to use technical terms, but then stop and explain them. Just don't use them like it's common knowledge that this is classical condition. And so you've really got to step back and try to put yourself in the student's place and ask them for questions. You can also, these days, they often have in classrooms or even on iPhones where you can click in. So you can ask questions during class. You think you're giving this great lecture, you ask 4 or 5 questions, half the class misses them. Well, I didn't do such a great job. So you can get immediate feedback for yourself. That's another thing testing is good for. It tells the teacher whether the teacher is doing a good job. So I think that's really important, and it's just something instructors always have to live with. And it's a very difficult problem to overcome, especially, one good thing about introductory psychology, so there is one section on human memory, but most of the stuff I'm talking about is not stuff I studied. So it's much easier for me to put it down at the level of the student because I'm not far from that level myself. So probably I should have a guest lecture for human memory or something. But the curse of knowledge is something I think instructors don't realize enough, and they should really keep in mind. And how exactly you train them to do this is very difficult. And you see it in student evaluations when they say the lectures were too high level or I just didn't understand what the professor. It doesn't happen in psychology as much as other fields. Math, physics, chemistry, things that people are great experts. You take a PhD in physics who's been teaching, for say 30 years, and now you say, oh God, the person teaching intro psych is on intro physics is on leave this year. Would you come teach intro physics? Well, if they've been teaching graduate level courses and now they have to come down and talk to people who just graduated from high school, you've just got this complete mismatch where they're probably going to have a difficult time of it. There is no easy answer, except for getting feedback, either in the form of giving quizzes in class and looking at your teaching evaluations. One good idea is to give teaching evaluations yourself. Usually the university does it at the end of the course, but you can give them every few weeks. How am I doing? And the students don't mind telling you when it's anonymous. They can be pretty brutal sometimes.
We found that the same way with professional learning. We do feedback right after, and we hear that a lot as well, that some of these amazing experts, thought leaders, just cannot pare it down, cannot give enough concrete examples for that learning to stick, that they're talking in too high of level, too abstract, and it just is not connecting. And they think they're doing that, but in most cases, they don't have a good self-awareness mechanism in place to say, is this really happening? And like you said, Roddy, even if it is happening, how do you fix it? That's equally challenging to do in most cases. So thank you for unpacking that. Before we end up, I'd like to go through just a few more strategies. We can do it somewhat shorter, but I just like to talk about priming because I know Robert Bjork said this. He says that's an area of research that's just coming into its own. But priming basically is before you learn something, is testing yourself on what you already know. How does that really help with learning and get the learning to stick?
He was referring to studies he's done where it's essentially what we talked about earlier, asking questions about material you don't know, but then presenting the information. That works better. Surprised he called it priming, but anyway, that priming has another meaning in psychology too. But you do kind of prime the pump. You get people ready to receive the information and they encode it better. Why that happens, we really don't know. It's like we do think that Janet Metcalf has done a lot of work showing how curiosity will drive memory. If you're really curious about something, you'll remember it, and when you find out the answer. And so asking that question helps drive up curiosity. Oh, what is the capital of Australia? I thought it was Sydney. Well, it's not Sydney. And so you drive up the curiosity when you find out, no, that's not what it was. And so I think that might be one mechanism by which it happens. But at a more, say, biological level, I don't think we know yet. Certainly I don't know yet.
To reinforce that, so part of it may be that when we give the wrong answer, later when we're given after reading about we're given the test, we may also generate that wrong answer, but then we remember, oh, but that wasn't right. Don't get sucked into that easy answer, easy because you generated it. It's a different answer, so I got to think a little bit more about that. And it turns out there's a really interesting study in the problem solving literature that showed when you give people a problem and you kind of guide them so they get the correct solution, and then you give them a transfer problem, and this problem leads you to a dead end. People who were guided toward the solution, they don't transfer as well. People who were struggled with the first problem and failed, they got to the dead end and then were given some feedback, they transferred much better. And the idea was because in their solving of the transfer problem, they were also moving toward the dead end because these were analogs, it's different. And then they realized, wait a minute, that's a dead end. I know that's a dead end. And instead, I've got to take these other steps. So the theory for that was learning also incorporates your failures and how to correct those failures. And if it doesn't, then when you start to give the wrong answer, you've got nothing, you've got no basis on which to correct it. So that's part of it. We think that's part of it.
I'll combine the last two because I want to get to these real quick because I think this really has been a game changer for me. Elaboration, the process of giving material meaning by expressing it in your own words, paraphrasing it, and not just trying to regurgitate it, but really synthesizing it to a deeper level. And the one strategy that I think all leaders and all professionals could work on, the other one is reflection. We don't do enough time reflecting on what we know, what we don't know. Did it work out? And that can be enhanced with elaboration as well. So perhaps just speak to those two briefly and provide some more insight into why those are so effective.
Well, I'll take elaboration. Elaboration is effective because it does what we've been talking about. It provides a lot of retrieval cues. You're embedding the information in things that you already know. You're providing explanations. You're understanding it. So let me give you a concrete example. We have a little demonstration to help students understand how elaboration is important, that it is important, and that it produces much better memory. We'll present a series of sentences that have arbitrary relations between a particular man and their actions. So the hungry man got in the car. The frightened man ran into the house, things like that. And you can give a series of 12 sentences like this. It's been done in research over and over. And people try to memorize them. They don't know what else to do, and they remember 3 or 4 of them. And then you say, look, a good way to remember these sentences is to elaborate them by trying to explain the cause for the action. Why did the hungry man get in the car? And most people say, well, he went to the restaurant or he went to the grocery store. Why did the sad man look at his boat? The sad man looked at his boat. Well, because the hurricane destroyed it, and now he was going to have. So people who give these who are instructed and give these explanations, and they can either be reasonable or they don't have to be reasonable explanations. During the memory tests, they get almost all of them, 11 to 12 of them. And a light goes off in their head. Elaboration, connecting these different parts through some sort of story that I've told or some sort of explanation I've generated from my prior knowledge. That's what creates memory. That's what creates retrieval. Memory then becomes generative. You don't have to remember the details, you remember the story, and the story allows you to generate the answer. And I've done this in Roddy's memory classes. We've done it with fifth grade students. We've done it with administrators at WashU. And it always works, always works. And people come out of that demonstration buzzing about the benefits of elaboration. But that's what it really is trying to explain and understand the connections that seem arbitrary to you. And almost all new information seems arbitrary. So when you're with your clients talking about training and learning new business techniques, some of it may seem arbitrary. If they can elaborate that and relate that to things they know, really explain why they think that would work, why that's a good technique. Now that gives them a schema, it gives them a mental model, and that gives them a way to generate these techniques. It's not memorizing them, it's generating them.
If you think of, say, using flashcards, so usually you're going through and you get this one right, you get this one wrong, you flip it over, you look at it and you say, oh, okay, that's what it is. Now suppose you stopped after you missed it and you looked at the question, you flipped it over, and now you stop and reflect. Well, wait a minute, why did I get the wrong answer? Or why did I draw a blank? Why is this the right answer? And then you use, essentially you, like Mark said, you form a story about why this is the right answer. Well, if you reflect on it, instead of just going to the next card because you're busy, but if you could force yourself to stop when you miss something and then reflect on it, why did I miss it? Why is this the right answer? How does it fit in with this question? And if you can't remember that, you go back and reread that part of the text. But if you can remember that, then you're good to go. You can, and it'll really help you the next time. But as I say, there's not really great, to my knowledge, unless Mark corrects me, there's not a whole lot of research on this. But I still think it's a good thing to do, especially when you're having difficulty with something. And to go back to it, not just to look at the right answer and say, oh, okay, I'll try to remember that next time, like it's a rote thing. No, it's not a rote thing. You really need to understand the underlying reason why that's the correct answer.
And I want to extend that to say reflection is also very useful from your reading. So when we read a text, as Roddy said, we've got to make inferences. We've got to make connections between the sentences, between the paragraphs in order to create this good structure. And oftentimes the author hasn't really given us the necessary signposts to make those connections. So you have to reflect while you're reading and say, does this really fit together? If I can't fit it together, I'm missing something because it needs to fit together. But it turns out we don't commonly do that. A study that had students read a technical scientific text found that there were a lot of places where they could benefit from reflection, and students just happily plowed right through those. I mean, you can look at when they stopped reading and they just plow right through them. It doesn't matter that that didn't make any sense or they couldn't connect it. They're just happy to keep reading and reading. And you really, so in many, many cases, right, I point out, you need to stop and reflect. Do I really understand that? Does it make sense? If it doesn't make sense, you need to work on helping it make sense. You can't just plow through it. So reflection it's really important. Yeah.
I can remember in college having, here I have a chapter I've got to read and I've got to get this done before X. And so you just sit there and plow through the chapter. Whether you're understanding it correctly or not, you won't find out till you go back later. But you set things have to be done by a certain time, and then you're going to meet that deadline.
And Charles, I would suggest that instructors need to reflect too. So, I mean, one of the things about these experts who aren't presenting the information at a level that's reasonable for the student is they're not really keeping their audience in mind. They're not reflecting on what the student probably knows and then saying to themselves, is what I'm going to say, does it connect with what they know? So I think oftentimes teachers and trainers like yourself have to reflect more on who's the learner here and what does the learner know? And I need to take that into account when I'm presenting the training materials. I think teachers are good, by and large are good, but sometimes they need to reflect a little bit more on who the learner is, and so that they can say design the materials with that in mind.
That's an excellent point. You're right. They need to reflect more on that, be more humble, and really get feedback from those students and not assume that it's connecting in the way they want to. And that would eliminate a lot of issues with higher education, our formal education, and professional training as well. I'd throw those all three in there at the same time. As we wrap up, what's one thing you would like listeners, leaders listening to this call to take from our conversation today to put into action, hopefully right away?
Well, I would say retrieval practice. So you want your employees to learn something, give them retrieval practice. We recently talked to a business owner in Omaha, Nebraska, who runs a restaurant who had knew about techniques from Make It Stick. And so he introduces new menu items. He wants his wait staff to know those items and know what wine they pair with. And he understands it's not enough just to give them a little study guide. He on Monday they have a team meeting. He does retrieval practice. He sees them in the restaurant on Wednesday. He asks them, "What are the new items on the menu?" And he just incorporates retrieval practice into the regular interactions in the restaurant, the regular training sessions. And he's got a restaurant that's never empty. He can't, he has to, no, I'm not kidding. He has to turn people away from the restaurant because his staff is so, they can tell you about the dessert. They can tell you about the different items on the menu and what wines they pair with. They know a lot about the food and they know a lot about the new items that are being offered. And that's all done through retrieval practice. And and Roddy can tell you a lot. Roddy and I have a little bit worked with companies that use these digital retrieval practice platforms to help train workers so they don't just get one lesson and that's it. Every week they're getting pinged on some retrieval practice. And the kinds of improvements that you find in performance are phenomenal. And so that would be the one thing that I would really, really push.
We got Mark and I and Peter Brown are working on a second book after Make It Sick, and this is going to be ways that companies, Mark and I on the Scientific Advisory Board, several companies, and companies and educational institutions and individuals have read Make It Stick and have used those principles. So, for example, Mark and I went out and spent 2 days with the Navy SEALs because one of the head trainers of the Navy SEALs wrote me out of the blue and said, "We read your book. We're worried we're not training the Navy SEALs as well as we could be. We should talk to us." So Mark and I flew out there and talked to them, and it was really a fun 2 days for us, and I hope for them. And they did adopt some of our techniques. They couldn't do everything, but just for practical reasons. So that was one. Harvard Medical School introduced a new curriculum based on Make It Sick. We will write that story up. Several other things like this, but these things really work. They really work in businesses. I'm on the scientific advisory board of a company called Amplifier, and they do training in hospitals. One training in one hospital was on sepsis, which is a common problem in hospitals. And surprisingly, doctors and nurses didn't, when they gave them a pretest, they didn't really have all the facts at their fingertips to recognize it. And so what they measured in this study, they worked in the hospital for a year and they measured lives saved compared to the 2 years before. So how much sepsis deaths went down. And that was significantly different after they introduced these principles. So, it's just had a huge impact, not just our book, but the whole Buick talking to people, other people talking to people and getting this information out there. So I think it really can be a good thing for people to try.
Of course, and thank you so much, both of you. A heartfelt thank you to Dr. Henry Roediger and Dr. Mark McDaniel for guiding us through such a powerful exploration of the science of learning and memory. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you or learn more about your work.
Well, reading Make It Stick is a good way to start off learning more about our work. And on both of our websites, I think, are probably almost all of our publications except for books. And so that's two ways. We're easy to find. We have a website that has our email address on it. So
Through the WashU Psychological Brain Sciences Department, our websites are embedded within that.
Thank you so much for joining, and thank all of you for listening. What stands out to me is this: while learning is never effortless, the most effective strategies are surprisingly accessible if we're willing to swap those quick fixes for proven evidence-based practices. And as we've heard today, the very struggle we often shy away from, retrieval, feedback, effortful practice, isn't failure. It's the fuel that drives lasting growth. So whether you're a leader, educator, or lifelong learner alike, take this to heart. If you want knowledge to stick, don't chase comfort. Lean into challenge, test yourself, mix it up, and stay curious. I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.